Everybody. Well, most of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Pastor Jeff Ware, pastor at All Saints Lutheran Church in Charlotte, Ballantyne area. I've been coming here now for most of this school year, hanging out, doing some apologetics, discussing these things. I've been enjoying the conversations each week and the opportunity to present here and there on different things. There's a lot to cover here today. And also a lot of crossover with the Buddhism presentation that we had a couple weeks ago, since Buddhism kind of grows out of Hinduism and shares quite a bit of principles and worldview. So some of it will be a little bit of review for those of you who are here 2 weeks. But yes, Hinduism is very complex, very difficult to cover, especially for someone like myself who has a Western worldview. Is a totally different mindset, totally different worldview, and very hard as a Western person to put yourself into an Eastern mindset and accurately and faithfully describe a religious position, an Eastern religious position. So I'm going to do my best, and bear with me, and if you have a correction or something like that, feel free to jump in and say, I don't think you got it quite right. Because again, it is a challenging thing, both worldview-wise and just the nature of Hinduism being incredibly diverse and complex. The reason I volunteered to teach this topic was because a few years ago I had an opportunity to go to India on a mission trip, and it was a wonderful and enlightening, no pun intended, experience. We traveled all around the country, learning about mission work being done there, visiting mission sites. I even got a chance to preach in a small country church outside of Madurai with an interpreter, my first time ever preaching with an interpreter, and my first time preaching over an hour, because the folks there told me, well, the people are expecting that you preach at least an hour, because most of them walked 3 hours to come to church one way. And they said, you better make it worth their trip. So anyway, that was very interesting, and I was exposed to the culture of India and the religion of Hinduism, and had a little bit of training before we went over there in some of the basic ideas of Hinduism, although my work on this presentation really helped to fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge. Hinduism is without a doubt probably the most complex religion today. It's the third largest religion after Christianity and Islam. Over 1 billion Hindus worldwide. It's interesting, though, the word Hindu is not a name that derives from within the Hindu religion. This is a name that was given probably by the Muslims, and it means either Indian or river. And here's a kind of a quote to kind of help you understand how difficult it is to wrap your mind around Hinduism. Quote here, Hinduism as a faith is vague, amorphous, many-sided, all things to all men. It is hardly possible to define it, or indeed to say definitely whether it is a religion or not, in the usual sense of the word. In its present form, and even in the past, it embraces many beliefs and practices from the highest to the lowest, often opposed or contradicting each other. So, it's a pretty daunting task to try to wrap your mind around something like that. Starting off talking a little bit about worldview here, Hinduism is a religion that's almost impossible for the Western mind to grasp, and that's because of a major worldview difference between Eastern and Western views of time and history. The Western worldview sees time and history as linear. Yes?
What is a worldview?
A worldview is a set of assumptions or beliefs which shape your entire view of reality, of life, of death, of afterlife. Everything is involved in a worldview. Yeah, and this particular worldview sees time and history in a cyclical as following sort of a cyclical pattern. We in the West see time and history as linear. You might say once for allness, right? Things happen kind of in a straight line. We have a past and you have a present and you have a future. In an Eastern worldview, this is viewed as in a cyclical kind of manner, or you might say many-timeness. And again, that's very hard to wrap your mind around. But the practical ramification of this difference in worldview applies to God and creation. The Western worldview sees God as distinct and before the line of creation, right? Distinct from and before time, creation, so forth. Whereas in an Eastern worldview sees God as within the circle of creation and creation as part of God. And there are a whole lot of other spiritual ramifications which follow either of those worldviews, which makes it very challenging. Some other challenges to understanding Hinduism is the great variety of understanding and practice within the religion itself. You have in many, and I saw this when I went to India, you have sort of the popular Hinduism of the masses which may or may not understand all of the tenets of the fully developed philosophical version of the religion. But so you have the popular religion and you have kind of a philosophical Hinduism, and they're in many respects very different. On the popular level, Hinduism is polytheistic. There's a worship of many gods and goddesses, 333 million plus gods and goddesses, although some have said there's just about one god for every Hindu believer. In the minds of many, on the popular level, they just see themselves as devoted to many gods or maybe one among many gods. They don't think too much beyond that reality. One Hindu woman I talked to in India said that she said, we worship the gods so that we're blessed and to appease them so that we will not suffer misfortune. And that was about the extent of her sort of understanding of the religion on a popular level. Now, while there are countless gods and goddesses worshipped, it's generally recognized that there are three main gods, and many Hindus would say that these three main gods really reveal the essence of God. And we'll talk about that concept in Hinduism as we go forward. But Brahma, the creator, and this is not to be equated with the philosophical concept of Brahman, which we'll talk about a little bit. Vishnu, the sustainer, Shiva, the destroyer. And so that's on the popular level. On the pantheistic or philosophical level, Hinduism is pantheistic. And so this is less focused on gods and goddesses and sacrifices, and more on meditation and enlightenment and the life of the mind, right? So the basic philosophy in this sort of highly developed philosophical Hinduism is this: there exists Brahman, one force, flame, or ultimate reality, and Atman is the soul or the spark from Brahman. Okay, I meant to say Brahman. Atman, the soul, as a spark from Brahman. So kind of this idea of this one all-encompassing force, and each individual soul is a spark from the flame of Brahman. Does that make sense? No, but we're Westerners, so. In order to understand the complexity of Hinduism, we can learn a little bit about the history and development of Hinduism as a religion. The period from 2500 to 1500 BC might be called pre-Hinduism. There's not really an overarching theology or philosophy or understanding or unity of Hinduism in this period. Those who dwelt in the Indus River Valley were part of a matriarchal society, and many of them worshipped feminine deities, mother goddesses, and so forth. All of that changed, and really the history of Hinduism as a religion starts with the ancient Aryans who came to India in approximately 1500 BC. They brought a much more complex religious philosophy with them, and were at the same time sort of dabbling with a lot of different ideas and bringing them all together. Polytheism, that is believing in and worshiping many gods and goddesses. Monism, that is believing everything is one, so there's no distinction between God and the world. Pantheism, that is believing that God is in everything and everything is God. And they also introduced the concept of Brahman, which I mentioned earlier. Again, Brahman's not a person or a deity per se, but instead Brahman is the ultimate oneness of all things. And they would call that ultimate oneness of all things Brahman, or sometimes on the popular level, God. And that's why in Hinduism, you have sort of both realities existing at the same time. You have many, many, many gods, and you have one ultimate God or one ultimate reality in Hinduism. And this is also why Hinduism often asserts that it can embrace all religions, because they see all other religions as just different manifestations of the one Brahman. So this period is named for the first sacred writings, the Vedic period, the first sacred writings of Hinduism, which were written and collected during this time, the Vedas. The Aryans also introduced the beginnings of the caste system, which I'm sure you're interested in hearing about, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's something we'll come up to. You were doing the Hindian head nod there. Yeah. All right, good. Now, this early Hinduism was very much a nature religion. There was a lot of worship of nature, animals. A lot of the local related gods were nature gods. And that can be seen in popular Hinduism today. And actually, while I was in India, I witnessed really the difference between popular Hinduism and philosophical Hinduism. This popular Hinduism is much closer to earlier, less developed Hinduism. And again, the general population is not necessarily aware of the deeper philosophical concepts of Hinduism. So all they know is that they need to worship and be devoted to the gods and offer the sacrifices to make sure good things happen rather than bad. And so here's a video. I went to Madurai when I was in India, and I went to the second largest Hindu temple in the world. And here's what I saw in the Hindu temple. I'll show you the video and then just talk about it in a second here, but it's a very short video clip here.
Statue there.
Flour, I think, or spices of some kind. So what was interesting is right at the beginning of that video, you see a young girl whispering into the ear of this stone cow, right? And the idea was that they were whispering their sins into the ears of the cow, offering their sacrifices, lighting candles, and all of this to sort of rectify bad karma that had been built up in their lives, which we'll talk about that too in a minute. But that's kind of an example of sort of popular Hinduism. These folks, most of them have no idea of, or no real deep concept of this idea of Brahman and all things are one and all of that. All they know is that there's all these gods and goddesses and we've got to placate them, right? And so anyway, that's why I saw that there in India. Well, the second major period in the development of Hinduism as a religion is called the Upanishadic period. During that time, the culture of India was unified. Uh-oh. Hold on a second. I lost my mouse for a second. All right. This is called the Upanishadic period because the Upanishads were written during this time. They're interpretations of the Vedas, which are the original holy books or scriptures. The Upanishads were much more philosophical in nature. They began to shift the religious thinking of Hindus away from sacrificial practices and more to the inner self. And this introduced the idea of the endless cycle of the soul's transmigration, the attempt to escape the cycle of rebirth through enlightenment. There's some similarities there with Buddhism we talked about, this idea of cycles of rebirth and so forth. This introduced the idea that consciousness is what unites everything. So the self that you experience in your consciousness is one with Brahman, the ultimate reality of the universe. And the challenge is to recognize that fact, to realize that fact. And so, interestingly enough, though, during this time, polytheism advances as well. And that's because it's taught that Brahman cannot be named and that the many forms of the different gods are all expressions of Brahman. And so you have large temples built. Here's a picture of the outside of that temple that I went to and that you saw the video from. So during this time, large temples are built where Hindus can come and worship many, even hundreds or thousands of deities in the same place. And each god is seen as a different aspect of Brahman. Developed Hinduism, 600 BC to today, also known as the Vedantic period or Vedanta period. Vedanta is another name for the Upanishads. And this is where Brahmanism becomes the dominant philosophy in Hinduism. There's greater development of Hinduism beyond worships and sacrifices to ethics and the inner life. So more contemplation and meditation on what does it mean to be good, and how do we escape the cycle of rebirth, including the four margas, the four ways to God, which we'll also discuss in a minute. So that's kind of a brief history, and again, if I had a little more time, I could have gone a little more in depth, but that's kind of, three main periods, and there's a development here going from sort of popular, just polytheism, to a more philosophical type expression of Hinduism. So let's get into the religious beliefs, starting with the spiritual foundation of Hinduism. The spiritual foundation is this: the universe exists from eternity, but has no material existence. Okay, no material existence. The universe is pure energy. And what appears to be material existence, everything that you see and feel and taste and touch and experience in this physical universe, this is all an illusion. Okay? It is a seeming transformation of energy to form. The concept of God is called Brahman, and Brahman is the universe, and the universe is Brahman. One of the sayings is, as the dream for the sleeper, the universe exists for God. God is the one soul, the universal soul, the one inclusive spiritual reality that includes all things and yet is more than all things. Hard to wrap your mind around again, right? And each individual soul, or Atman, is but a reflection of the universal soul, Brahman, that pervades all. Again, like we talked about, as the spark to the flame, right? The purpose of life in modern Hinduism is enlightenment, the realization of the oneness of Atman and Brahman, that I am one with the all. Hinduism believes in a cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And again, this is tough to understand because of our linear versus cyclical view of time and history. But in Hinduism, all of life is governed by a law of birth, death, and rebirth. And that law is called the Wheel of Life. Very similar concept in Buddhism we discussed a couple weeks ago. Or samsara. Samsara applies to all living beings. So human beings may not end up being reborn as humans. They might be reborn as animals. The goal of life for Hindus is to be freed from samsara, and that liberation from the cycle of rebirth is called moksha. And according to this belief, Hindus can be reborn into a higher state of life, moving gradually upward, incarnation to incarnation, lifetime to lifetime, born in better and better circumstances, each time with a better chance at achieving moksha, the release from the cycle of rebirth. How someone is reborn, or in what condition they are reborn, is determined by the law of karma. And so whatever you do in your life affects what you will be in the next life. And karma is sort of a cold, unfeeling, graceless kind of concept, right? You do good, you're going to get good. You do bad, you're going to get bad. Period. Right? The best way to ensure good karma is to do good deeds and follow one's duty or dharma. Dharma is duty. So, there's no real concept of sin in Hinduism as we would see it. The closest thing to sin would be to ignore one's dharma or to ignore one's duty, to not do your duty. Failing to do one's duty ends up building up bad karma and increases the chance of an unfavorable rebirth. So, the goal then is to get to moksha, right? Out of this cycle of rebirth. And there is a sort of a fourfold path, or 4 ways of God, or 4 ways to God, different kinds of worship as ways to moksha or ways to spiritual freedom. The first way is knowledge, the Jnana Yoga, the path of insight, or some call it the reflective path. This path stresses the quest for spiritual knowledge and truth. And so the goal is to understand that Atman and Brahman are one and that physical reality is Maya or illusion. Right? So step on this road here is to come to this realization, right? Works, the karma yoga, the path of action, working with all your power. This involves Hindus doing their dharma or doing their duty to the best of their ability. And this duty is different for everyone depending on their caste, their job, their social status, or their state of life, whether they're children or married or older people. You have different duties according to your situation in life, and you are to do your duty, right? You're to do the dharma. Discipline is another path to moksha. This would involve, this is called Raja Yoga, the path of integration of self. This involves contemplation and breathing exercises to achieve non-thinking and thus to exist in pure divinity. So because the illusion or the maya of the world is powerful, the idea here is that Hindus need to train their minds through meditation to see the world as it truly is, right? How many of you have seen The Matrix? Right? There is no spoon, right? All of it is an illusion, right? And Neo reaches enlightenment when he realizes, right, that it's all an illusion. So you train your mind through meditation to see the world as it truly is. Meditation involves concentrating to focus the mind and control your thoughts, to go beyond the conscious self and detach from the world of illusions. And so some of the meditation techniques include using a mantra. A mantra is a word or a phrase or a sound that's repeated over and over and over again. Or you might focus on a mandala, a symbolic circle or diagram that represents the universe or the self. And through these meditation practices, you're training your mind to see the world as it truly is. The fourth path is devotion, or bhakti yoga, the path of devotion. And this is where a Hindu person will center their life and their worship and their love around one particular God that one chooses as the ideal God. And so you choose a particular deity and you spend your life worshiping that deity, and you see your religious identity as tied to this particular deity. And so sometimes deities are chosen because they have particular qualities or powers or so forth that you want to be brought to bear to your life. Let's talk a little bit about Hindu rituals. Puja is the worship of one or more of the Hindu deities, and that worship almost always involves an image or a statue of the deity. The image is called a murti, M-U-R-T-I. And when they worship the murti, they don't consider themselves as worshiping the image, but the God that the image represents. So remember that the gods are all just different aspects of the one Brahman reality. And so, when you're worshiping one of these gods, you're not worshiping the image, you are worshiping what the image represents. And that deity represents ultimately Brahman, right? Or an aspect of Brahman.
So like, Christians, Muslims, Jews say God is immaterial. So do Hindus have gods that are immaterial?
Well, they would say, I think they would say that they are all immaterial. The images are not worshipped as such. Now, again, you have differences between the popular level understanding of these things and the more developed philosophical level understanding of these things, right? On the popular level, I don't know if the average person makes that kind of a distinction, right? So a puja usually takes place in the home. This worship usually takes place in the home, but it can be conducted in a temple as well. In the home, most Hindu families are going to have a place of worship in their home, some kind of a shrine, or maybe multiple shrines set up to one or more gods. The ritual involves removing your shoes, and you ring a bell to summon the deity that the image represents. They call that the murti. They light a lamp or a candle and they burn incense. They might play music to the deity because the deities like to hear music. A small amount of red paste is placed on the foreheads of the murti and the worshippers. And some of you guys have seen Hindu folks with a red dot, right? There's all kinds of reasons why this is done. Some just think it's a cosmetic and beautiful thing to do. Others see this as a representation of the third eye, or the unity between the worshiper and the deity, in that they both have this dot. Or this sort of this, the inner guru, the inner I, recognizing that they and Brahman are one. You might offer food to the deity, or light, or flowers. The lamp is moved around the image to indicate the presence of God, of the god. And the devotees place both of their hands above the lamp and then touch their foreheads and receive the blessing of the god, right? You might have seen that kind of action being done if you've ever witnessed the worship of one of these deities, going over the flame, and it's kind of like you're pulling in the blessing, right? If in the temple, worship is very similar, but you'll have in the temple a complex of shrines, many different shrines to many different deities, and these same or very similar procedures are led by the priests in the case of being in the temples. And of course, the temples are the locations for big festivals and holidays for the different gods and so forth. Om, and you can see the picture there is the picture of the sound Om in Sanskrit. Om is the most holy mantra or sacred sound in Hinduism, symbolizing the gods, the Vedas, and embodying all things and all souls. Any questions? Running through it. All right, ethics. Ethical action in Hinduism has two goals. One is personal happiness, and personal happiness happens through these three different ways. Kama, the accumulation of pleasure. Dharma, the accumulation of goodness. And artha, the accumulation of useful things like money and property and so forth, right? These are ways to achieve personal happiness. And kind of the idea is that, you're born into the situation that you're born in, and you kind of got to hang out here for a while until your next incarnation, so you might as well be as happy as you can be, right? And so, accumulate pleasure and do as much good as you can, and be dutiful, and do your duty, and accumulate stuff, material goods, things that make you happy. Yeah. And then the second goal of ethical action is to achieve moksha, or sometimes called nirvana, and that is the release from the material world and the cycle of reincarnation, and perfect oneness with the divine. And if that can't be achieved in this life, at least progress will be made, hopefully, to start out in a better position in the next life. Yeah.
So these are two things that would be ethical to go for. What would be unethical?
The biggest thing you don't want to do is to act outside of your dharma, right? So we'll talk about sin in a minute, and the Hindu concept of sin, but Hinduism doesn't really have a concept of sin like we have. Acting, not doing your duty, or acting contrary to your station is kind of the worst thing that you can do in Hinduism. Yeah.
So, if acting outside of your dharma is the worst thing you can do, what if your dharma is something that does something bad, like hurt someone else or what have you, or deprave someone else to something vile? And if so, or if not, how do you even determine what your dharma is?
Well, so the Vedas, the earliest scriptures in Hinduism have a lot of rules laid down for the different castes, and we'll talk about the caste system in a minute. But for your different stations in life, a lot of rules to guide those stations in life, and so that would be where they would start. But again, Hinduism does not have the kind of developed I guess the kind of concept of objective good and evil that we would have in Christianity, or even just as Western people. It's all kind of relative to your station in life. And so depending on what your station in life is, you might be called to do something that, according to another station in life, would not be considered ethical. Although, to be fair, that's also, there is a similar correspondent to that even in a Western worldview, right? I mean, of acting according to your station. I mean, if I knocked you out and cut you open, that'd be a problem, right? But if I was a doctor who was doing surgery, then that wouldn't be a problem, right? It would actually be for your good. And so, even in our culture, we understand that some things are right and wrong depending on the calling that you're fulfilling, right? And so there would be a similar kind of idea in Hinduism. So let's talk about the caste system. A lot of people wonder about that. And as I said earlier, the caste system was introduced during that early Vedic period by the Aryans, and through time it was developed further along with the philosophical developments of Hinduism. So, this caste system is retained, but it's explained more fully and integrated as Hinduism develops, right? At first it's just for social order. Later on, it's seen as an integral part of the way that you achieve moksha. So in traditional Hindu society, all life was arranged as a hierarchy. And they really thought of it kind of like the human body. You have, in your human body, you have all the different parts, right? And all of those parts are necessary, although some parts are more important than other parts, right? And so they would say, well, society is kind of the same way. We have to have all of these different parts in society. Some are more important and others are less important, right? This is kind of the early way of thinking about this. So you have the Brahmins. This is the priestly caste, and they are the ones who study and teach in matters of faith, and they lead the ritual life of Hindus. I have a hard time pronouncing Kshatriyas. They're the warrior caste, and their role is to protect the people and run a fair government. So they're the kings, they're the governors. You have the Vaishyas. They're the traders, the merchants, farmers, artists, business people. They take care of the economic needs of the community. And then you have the Sudras, the lowest caste, and they are the servants of the three higher castes. They're the unskilled workers, the servants, and so forth. And then this fifth category is not, some would argue, is not present in early Hinduism, but is a later development, and that is the Dalits, or the untouchables, or the outcasts, right? They have no caste, and they're forbidden from interacting with members of the other four castes. They were consigned to doing the dirtiest jobs in society, and they lived separately from everyone else. So in a Hindu way of thinking, you are born into a certain class of people. You're born into a caste. There are roles and jobs and social status and religious structures, all organized according to this hierarchy. And following one's dharma, or doing one's duty, means strictly following the rules of your caste. There's no opportunity, at least originally in Hindu thought, of going up or down in the caste structure in this life. You're born into it. You might be able to be born into a higher caste in a future life if you play your cards right in this life, right? But you're stuck in your caste. Acting above or below your caste is ignoring your duty and generates bad karma. And so your only hope for rebirth is to the only hope for improving your position is to be reborn into a higher level. And that can only happen by accepting your lot in life and following strictly the rules of your caste. Now, today in India, things have gotten a bit more progressive, and so discrimination based on caste is illegal. However, a lot of society still lives according to those principles. So, especially, on a popular level, marriage outside of one's caste is considered really a bad thing, a bad choice. You still have all kinds of problems where people of a higher caste won't work for someone of a lower caste. So even though this is officially illegal in India to discriminate, it happens all the time. And it's because it's so ingrained in society and religion that it's hard to, it would take a long time for that to really change.
So what's the presupposition of castes as it pertains to non-Hindus? Like, how do they look at us? Where do we, where would I belong in a caste? Or is that just
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. No.
You need to look at the history with colonialization and all that kind of stuff to see how they interacted with like European powers and stuff. That probably give you a good concept.
Well, there is also some racism connected with the caste, and some of that had, at least historically, had to do with the color of your skin as well. Generally, the higher castes were lighter skinned and the lower castes were darker skinned. So, they may look at Western white people as sort of being automatically of a higher caste, although I don't know. I really don't know. So,
just while we're on this topic too, when I taught on Buddhism a couple of weeks ago, I didn't bring up the whole caste because I knew we would get to it here. But anyway, the point is the Buddha actually rejected the whole caste system at the time.
Yeah.
Just so you guys know, now that we know what it is and what it's about. So even during that time, that was one of the things he rejected out of Hinduism. There were other distinctions too, but especially the caste system.
So, in fact, what you got now too is some of the modern Hindu teachers will try to argue that the Hindu sacred writings never intended to promote discrimination based on caste. But again, I think that's trying to recast the history. All right, so let's. I want to quickly cover some comparing of views between Christians and Hindus on some key concepts and teachings. So start out here with God. Christians would speak of God as eternal, personal, spiritual being in three persons as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, Brahman is formless, abstract, eternal being without attributes. He takes form in a trinity as well as millions of lesser gods. We talked about those three main gods. There's in Hinduism they would maybe talk of a Trinity type concept, but not anything like what we would discuss, because this could also be in millions of lesser gods as well. View of Jesus Christ. Christians would say that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God the Father. He is God as well as man. He is sinless and he died for our redemption. In Hinduism, Jesus is seen as just one of many incarnations or sons of God. Jesus was not the Son of God, and he was no more divine than any other man, and he did not die for man's sins. View on sin. In Christians, sin is proud, independent rebellion that separates humans from God. It is falling short of the standards God has established in his word to men. Sin must be punished, and its consequence is death and eternal separation from God. In Hinduism, good and evil are relative terms. Whatever helps is good, whatever hinders is vice. Man cannot help stumbling over these obstacles as he strives to know himself. If he cannot succeed in this life, he may try again in reincarnated form. So you kind of get a second chance, right? In Hinduism, if you didn't quite get it right? The 100th time, there's always the 101st. Salvation. For Christians, human beings are justified through the sacrificial death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who died in our stead. In Hinduism, man is justified through devotion, meditation, good works, and self-control. And here notice the real difference, right? Salvation, justification, is either gift from God or the result of one's work. And way back when I talked about the differences among do all paths lead to God, remember I said that's the one thing that distinguishes Christianity from all other religions. All other religions are religions of works salvation, and Christianity is the only religion that says salvation happens as a gift. So, talk about in our last few minutes here, actually not doing too bad. How do we as Christians approach conversing with Hindus? And I think the first thing we need to do is appreciate the challenge of translating worldviews. Working on this presentation today, just, it works your mind over, It's really hard for me as a Western person to wrap my mind around this religion. And so you can expect that probably works the same way as they're trying to think about Christianity. And as we're trying to talk with each other and make sure we're not talking past each other, right? So, my advice here is to ask a lot of questions, try to understand how your Hindu friends and neighbors see things and understand things before you try to explain your own view. Learn as much as you can about their own personal beliefs, recognizing that within Hinduism there are many different variations, and so you can't assume that maybe they just hold to a popular Hinduism. They may be very philosophical, or they may be. You can't assume. You really have to ask questions and try to understand each individual person individually and what they believe. And if you do so, then it'll make it easier for you to communicate effectively. When it comes to God talk, it's very important to be specific. Because Hindus talk about God all the time. So if you start talking about God without being specific, they will assume that you're talking about the same concept, right? So they're not, when they say they believe in God, they're not saying they believe in the Christian God. They're talking about probably this Brahman reality, right? And so you have to be specific, or else it's going to be nonsensical. And so it's better, I think, to really start with Jesus and how Jesus reveals God, right? How Jesus is the visible image of the invisible Father. You start with how we come to know God through Jesus, right? And that helps to avoid the confusion of generalized God talk. Also, in approaching conversations with Hindus, we need to recognize a few challenges that may exist even before that conversation takes place. One, sorry.
So do they see God as like a being in the sense that we would see God as a being? I didn't quite.
No, not really.
So saying it's a reality or a state.
So I think I worded it pretty good here. So formless, abstract, eternal being without attributes. Right? Without attributes. And again, that's really hard. Not a personal being in the sense that we would think of God, right? Yeah. More of like the Force, right? And I'm not talking midichlorians. No, not that. Right? Did somebody else? Okay. So some of the challenges to even talking to a Hindu, one is that for many in India, Christianity was introduced to them in the context of foreign rule, British occupation. And so they may have, especially if they're from India, they may have a bad taste in their mouth about Christians in general, because they see that as connected with their past of foreign rule. Also, Islam has made very violent inroads into India. And so for many Hindus, foreign religions are just bad, right? I mean, just bad. We don't want to even consider any other claims of foreign religions because their experience with foreign religions has been bad. When I went to India, even though I was there as a pastor and doing pastoral things, I was not able to wear my typical uniform because if I did, I would be arrested and deported. For wearing my uniform when I went to India. My clerical collar, right? And we had to go in as a sort of secretly as tourists. We could not state as our purpose in coming mission worker evangelization because actually in many parts of India proselytization is illegal and you're not allowed to do mission work.
Well, isn't there at least one state though, like in India? Because there's like I heard there's like one state in India or whatever province, I don't know what you call it, that's like Christian majority. Could you like go there as a? Well,
we went everywhere. We just went undercover.
Okay.
And we didn't go to certain places because there had been actual violence against Christians and churches that were burned and Christians that were killed. There were especially up kind of in the northern areas where there's a lot of religious tension. So, furthermore, many Hindus see culture, government, and religion as intertwined and inseparable. And so for many Hindus to convert means to be ostracized from the family and the community and to essentially be giving up on your whole culture and heritage. That's the way it's seen. But I do think the best approach to start with is to love them. And isn't that what we've been called as Christians to do, right? To love all people. Many Hindus have very high ethical standards and they appreciate the same with Christians. We will earn their respect when we love and serve them. The downtrodden and the lower castes especially have been reached by Christians who love them and serve them even when the higher castes will not. And so Christianity has really spread among the lower castes because Christianity has been friendly and loving and caring when their own people have not. It's important to explain, again, not using generic God talk, but explain how God is personal and how we can come to know God through Jesus Christ, as Jesus reveals God. And so the Bible surpasses the Vedas in communicating how personal God really is, and that's a very attractive thing for many Hindus who are considering Christianity. And then finally, emphasize but one more thing, emphasize the gospel. Because Hinduism is at root a religion of works. Again, salvation's completely up to you doing your duty and building your good karma. And as we all know or should know, a religion of works is ultimately hopeless. Because if you're honest with yourself, you realize that you can't live up to even your own standards. A way of putting that to the Hindu is, no one's karma is perfect. Right? How can you ever know that you've done enough to make progress? So we present the gospel to them. You can even say, God gave Christ to take our bad karma, right? Help them to kind of develop that idea from this sort of generic idea of karma to what sin really is, and help them to see that sin is a much bigger problem even than bad karma, and Christ is the answer for that. Forgiveness is a gift. And when I was in India, I was talking to a missionary, and he told me the story of how he went to this remote village. They believed that no missionary, at least to their knowledge, had ever been there. And they went into this village, and he was going door to door and telling people about Jesus. And this elderly, about 70-year-old woman asked this man to sit on her front stoop. And they sat and they chatted together, and he presented the gospel to her, and she was angry. Angry. She said, "What took you so long? I could have died without knowing this. All my life, the gods have been angry and demanding, and I have lived in fear. And you come and you tell me, God loves me. God forgives me. What took you so long? I could have died." I mean, that's I think a really powerful story, and I think and this is something I definitely experienced when I went to India, and I went into that Hindu temple, that second largest Hindu temple in the world. It was dark, it was oppressive. There were deep, scary mantras being played over loudspeakers, and on every pillar, demonic figures looming down on people, gods with necklaces of skulls and fingers, necklaces of fingers, and this just evil, demonic, sort of threatening presentation of the gods, and people bowing and scraping in fear. When those people hear of a God who loves them,
Wow.
that's powerful.
Amen.
It's incredibly powerful. One of my friends, we split up when we split up, and some of my friends went to another part of the country, and at the church that they were visiting, they had 2,000 baptisms in one day. It was like Acts all over again. It was as simple as telling people, there's a God who loves you. It's pretty amazing. So I think also, finally, one other thing we can do, thinking apologetically, especially if we're talking to Hindus in this country, a lot of them are probably fairly philosophically inclined in regards to their own religion, more apt to think deeply about some of these things. One of the things that we can do as apologists is show how Christianity can be substantiated objectively and shown to be historically and objectively true. And whereas Hinduism, which is a philosophy, right? We talked about that in my presentation. A philosophy, an opinion that cannot be proven or disproven, falls short in that regard. All right. One final thing. I'll give this handout to you. When I went to India, they did a little training with us and tried to help us wrap our minds around Hinduism. This is a little handout, kill a few trees, called Your Questions, Our Answers by Primraj Dharmanand. A look at questions commonly posed by Hindus to Christians. So this is written in India. This is written in India by a Christian in India and translated into English. And so this is like street level stuff. Like what do Hindus ask Christians, and what are the answers to that? So hopefully that's a helpful handout to you. And with that, that's it for my presentation. Anybody have any questions? Sorry, I was rushing through that, trying to cover all that. I know it's a lot to take in.
I'll take one, Jeff.
Oh.
Devin, you can keep all the extras if you want.
we'll put them in the locker, and then anybody can come. Any questions?
So, would you say that Hindus subscribe to objective truth or subjective truth, or do they even really, or is that even a distinction to them?
I would say, I guess I would say subjective. I won't know what how a Hindu would answer that question, but yeah.
So we know that Buddhism came from Hinduism, and there's a lot of similar things like reincarnation and karma and whatnot. Do you know where so we know that Hinduism is the origin for Buddhism, but where is the origin of these ideas for Hinduism? Like, where do they come from?
Well, as we were going through the history there, the Aryan people, is where this comes from, who migrated or who came into India. But I don't know the history there beyond that. I think it's just people trying to think and make sense of what they see without some kind of revelation from God, right? I mean, you can imagine, right? We know that the Bible says that we can know that God exists and know some of God's attributes by the book of nature, right? Observing the world and observing ourselves, right? We can observe the world and we can see design and order that reveals God's power. We can look at ourselves and see that there seems to be that people are born with a basic sense of right and wrong, and people ask the question, well, where did that come from? That must come from somewhere. So there must be a God or gods that exist out there, right? Well, the minute that thought happens, then you begin to think, well, I wonder what these gods or gods think of me. And so philosophies begin to develop. You might wonder, I know that I don't do all the good that I know I should do, so maybe the gods are upset with me. So maybe I need to offer sacrifices or do something to placate the gods or God. Maybe these gods or God want me to acknowledge their existence. And so forms of worship develop. I mean, you can see how without any other revelation, just going off the book of nature, you come to any number of thousands upon thousands of different conclusions and religions that could come from that, And so it's not a surprise that we have this develop, these kinds of philosophies develop very early on, just simply from people reflecting on life and trying to make sense of the universe. And it develops slowly over time. Any other questions?